The August sun was still high when their car pulled away, a quiet whisper of tires on gravel, and my mother's perfume hanging in the air like a lie. I stood at the edge of Aunt Margaret's porch with two suitcases at my feet and a smile I didn't feel waving because my father had told me to wave. The taillights flickered once at the end of the drive, then turned right and vanished behind the maples that arched over the road like clasped hands. A cicada buzzed somewhere in the hedges, relentless, as if marking time I couldn't yet count. Aunt Margaret's porch boards were warm under my bare heels, and the lemonade glass in my hand had already left a ring on her oak table. A couple of days my father had said so lightly it might have floated away if I hadn't held it tight. I kept holding it, the phrase and the glass, as the afternoon light thinned toward gold, and the first evening breeze lifted the curtains in the blue bedroom she'd just repainted for me. I told myself that the silence was normal, that they'd call before dinner, and I set my phone on the windowsill where the signal was strongest, like a lighthouse with no ship to save. Before I take you further, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever felt quietly set aside by the people who should have stood by you, tap that like button and subscribe. These stories are for anyone who's had to learn the difference between words and love. It helps more than you know. But to understand how that summer afternoon changed the axis of my life, you need to know what came before the careful picture frame of a family and the hairline cracks no one wanted to see. I grew up in Portland, in a modest house where my mother taught piano in the front room, and my father kept his ties color-sorted in a neat row. My report cards were slid under magnets on the fridge, my recital programs saved in plastic sleeves, and our Sunday evenings were always reserved for dinner at Aunt Margaret's. She was my father's older sister, unmarried by choice, a real estate business owner who somehow made spreadsheets feel like secrets worth knowing. Where my parents measured affection in corrected posture and properly sharpened pencils, Aunt Margaret measured it in questions. What did you notice today? What did it feel like? She never minded when my answers were about the way evening light collects on a spoon, or how maples make a sound like breath when wind moves through them. For a long time, we passed as a tidy family. I made the volleyball team learn to take pictures with the school newspaper and kept a quiet journal because Miss Wilkins said it would teach me to trust my thoughts. But when I was 13, the quiet in our house changed its tone. I began to hear my parents speaking in the kitchen late at night, voices low and tight, like strings turned past tune. My father had always talked about the market with a gleam in his eye, this fund, that opportunity. And at first, the urgency sounded like victory. Then the name shifted to things like liability and exposure, and my mother's footsteps began pacing grooves into the linoleum. The year I turned 14, my parents started taking quick weekend trips, the kind of travel that never included a spare seat for their only child. Neighbors checked on me. I learned how to make grocery lists and how long a load of laundry could sit in the washer before it soured. I learned to play the house quiet as if it were a piano I could soften with the right touch. On Monday mornings, my mother's smile appeared as scheduled for her students, the scent of her florals filling the hall. On Tuesday nights, I ate boxed macaroni at the counter and pretended the house had always been this hollow. Aunt Margaret noticed without pushing. When I confessed in the passenger seat of her old sedan that I felt like a piece of furniture someone had left in the wrong room, she gripped the wheel and said, "Family is complicated, sweetheart, but you will never be unwanted in my home." The words settled like a blanket around shoulders that had grown used to bracing. Then came the spring I turned 15, when the truth stopped hinting and walked through the front door. I learned that my father had lost his job, not from him, but from the way my mother pinched the phone against her shoulder and hissed, "Unauthorized means you can't pretend you didn't know," to her sister. His desk went quiet. Our mailbox filled with unfamiliar envelopes. He spent long afternoons behind a closed bedroom door, speaking in a whisper that didn't belong to the man who used to explain compounding interest at the dinner table. My volleyball season came and went without my parents in the bleachers. Aunt Margaret clapped so loudly at one game that the referee looked up and grinned, and later she bought me a vanilla cone with rainbow sprinkles. "Win or lose, you showed up," she said. I nodded, like that simple math hadn't just rescued my whole day. That August afternoon looked like every other Oregon summer day, soft air light, like honey. The hedges neatly clipped, the garden hose coiled beside the porch. "Pack enough for a couple of days," my father said, standing in my doorway with his tie loosened and his eyes not quite finding mine. "Your mother and I have some business in Seattle. Your aunt offered to keep you." He tapped the doorframe, twice a habit he had when he wanted to seem casual. My mother kept moving through rooms, folding things that didn't need folding, her perfume arriving before she did. I packed too carefully. Favorite jeans, 2 sundresses, the soft sweatshirt I wore to late practices, the black sandals that made my legs look longer. I slid my journal into the side pocket like a secret I didn't want to leave behind. The suitcases felt heavier than clothes. Aunt Margaret's house sat on the outskirts of town, a restored Victorian, with a wraparound porch and a yard that smelled like rosemary and damp earth. She met us at the steps with a tray lemonade beating cold on the glasses, still warm cookies stacked in a blue bowl. "You'll like the blue bedroom," she said to me with an easy smile that didn't force anything. "Fresh paint. It's the color of morning when the sky hasn't decided yet." My father checked his watch. My mother stood at the edge of the porch, too upright for comfort, and avoided the tray. "We should get on the road before traffic," my father announced, like the city might close in behind him if he didn't outrun it. My mother leaned in arms, skimming my shoulders in a hug that felt like a measuring tape. "Be good for your aunt," she said, and the old piano teacher's smile lifted, but didn't quite reach the eyes I knew too well. "Couple of days," my father repeated, patting my shoulder. He had always been a man of lists and promises. He made it sound like this was nothing. The car door thumped shut with an ordinary sound that didn't match the way my stomach tightened. I waved because that was what a good daughter did, and because if I didn't wave, I might show my aunt something I didn't understand. The taillights blinked their small red goodbye, and the gravel settled back into place. The maples kept their secrets. Inside, the blue bedroom smelled faintly of fresh paint and lavender. Sunlight spilled across the quilt like an invitation. Aunt Margaret set my suitcases by the dresser, then gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Unpack at your own pace," she said. "I'll be downstairs if you want more cookies," which would be a completely reasonable choice. We smiled at each other in the mirror over the dresser, me with a ponytail meant for travel, her with the kind of smile that could absorb your worst day and make room for it. Dinner was chicken and green beans and sliced tomatoes from her garden, the kind of meal that doesn't need to be fancy to feel like home. We didn't talk about my parents much. Aunt Margaret had a way of pouring attention without prying, as if she knew I needed the world to be ordinary for one more evening. After the dishes, we sat on the porch in the late light, 2 moths tapping at the screen like tiny, persistent wishes. I kept my phone on the table between us. We both pretended we weren't watching it. They didn't call that night. Aunt Margaret turned on the porch light before we went upstairs, the warm glow catching the edges of the hydrangeas like a benediction. I put my phone on the windowsill because that was where the signal was best, and slept in a bed that still felt like a guest bed, rehearsing the conversation that would surely come in the morning. "How was your first night?" my mother would ask, as if weather. "We'll be home by Friday," my father would say like math. Friday came quietly. The phone made other noises, an app update, an alert about a sale at the shoe store, a group text from teammates, but none of them were the one noise my body had been taught to wait for. I ate toast with butter and honey and tried to remember what it felt like not to brace. By Sunday evening, Hope had learned to sit down and stop making a scene. Aunt Margaret poured 2 mugs of chamomile tea and put a plate of shortbread between us. "You don't have to pretend this is fine," she said, not unkindly. I had promised myself I wouldn't cry. Somehow, that made it worse. On Tuesday, an email arrived, not to me, but to Aunt Margaret. The subject line was tidy and dry update. My aunt read it in the kitchen, the click of her mouse too loud in the silence, and called me in with that tone adults use when they are trying not to frighten a child. The message was brief, crafted like a business memo. They had opportunities abroad. They believed I would be better off with stability. There was a sentence about being in touch soon, which felt like a napkin tossed over a stain. I stood in the kitchen with my palms pressed flat to the cool counter and watched the words do their work, peeling away the last layers of a story I had been covering with nicer paper. The clock over the stove ticked steady and indifferent. Outside, a crow called once and then again, as if underlining a line I didn't want to read. Aunt Margaret didn't say, "They won't be back." She didn't say anything that night that might become an echo I'd resent later. She made grilled cheese, the butter leaving a crisp lace on the bread, and sat across from me while I chewed more slowly than any human ever has. After dinner, she found an extra blanket and set it on the chair by my bed. "In case the night turns colder than you expect," she said, and kissed the top of my head like it was the most natural thing in the world. I went back to the blue bedroom and opened my journal because my hand needed to move even if the world felt stalled. The pen scratched across the paper, 2 suitcases, a porch light, no call. I wrote it again slower, as if the repetition could conjure a different ending. It didn't. The phone stayed on the windowsill, cold glass, catching a sliver of streetlight. Somewhere down the hall, Aunt Margaret turned a page of her book, a comforting whisper of paper on paper. I lay on my side and watched the shadows the hydrangeas made against the curtain, soft and wavering like someone breathing. That was how the first week began, on a quiet street at the edge of Portland, in a blue bedroom with a phone that didn't ring, and a girl who understood before she could admit it that some goodbyes don't announce themselves. They just keep not calling until the silence becomes the only sound you recognize. And when the porch light finally clicked off, the room felt larger than it had any right to feel, as if I'd been left alone in a house I didn't yet know how to live in. I lay still and kept listening, certain I could hear the absence collecting in the corners, steady as breath. The silence after that first week had a weight of its own. It settled into corners pressed against doorframes and lingered in every unanswered ring of the telephone. Aunt Margaret never said the words I knew were coming. She didn't have to. Each morning, she set an extra plate out of habit, and each night, she quietly put it away again. After a while, she stopped setting it altogether. She enrolled me in the local high school, the one with the brick courtyard and ivy climbing the gym wall. I arrived in the middle of sophomore year, the new girl with guarded eyes and a Portland accent that marked me as slightly out of place. My classmates asked the usual questions: where I'd moved from, if my parents worked downtown, and I gave polite, practiced answers. The truth felt too raw, too unbelievable, so I folded it up inside me, like the letter that never came. Aunt Margaret's house became a soft rhythm I learned by heart, the smell of roasted coffee in the mornings, the creak of the back porch steps, the hum of her old radio tuned to the local news. She had rules, but they were made of reason, not control. Do your best, she'd say, but don't mistake exhaustion for success. It was the opposite of what I'd grown up hearing. In her world, achievement was measured in effort and kindness, not perfection. It took months before I believed that. At night, when sleep came slow, I'd wander downstairs. I'd find her already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses perched low on her nose, going over papers for one of her real estate clients. She always looked up and smiled, as if she'd been waiting for me. Then she'd make 2 mugs of hot chocolate each, topped with a small swirl of whipped cream, and we'd talk until the sky began to lighten. Sometimes we talked about practical things, grades, dinner plans, whether the hydrangeas needed pruning. Other times, she'd tell stories about her travels walking the streets of Prague in winter, bargaining for linens in a tiny shop in Lisbon. Her life had been large and brave, and for a girl who had been left behind, that kind of courage sounded like freedom. She never spoke ill of my parents, even when I wanted her to. People's choices reflect them, not you, she'd remind me gently. I used to think that was her way of protecting me. Later, I realized she was teaching me how not to harden. That first Christmas came quietly. We didn't put up a big tree, just a small one on the side table near the window, its branches trimmed with glass ornaments she'd collected over the years. Each one had a story, where it came from, who gave it, or what year she'd bought it for herself after closing a difficult deal. On Christmas Eve, we sat by the fire and opened a single present each. Mine was a journal bound in soft brown leather with a note tucked inside. Write what you see, what you feel, and what you never want to forget. The truth becomes lighter when you give it words. I didn't know it then, but that journal would become my way back to myself. Weeks turned into months. My parents never called, never wrote. Aunt Margaret handled the legal parts quietly. I remember sitting in Mr. Harrison's office, the family lawyer she trusted, while he explained what the process meant. Guardianship, he called it. The word sounded like armor. He was kind, with silver-rimmed glasses and the steady voice of someone who had seen too many families fall apart. "You're fortunate to have someone who stepped in," he said softly. I nodded, unsure how to answer, because gratitude and grief had started to sound too much alike. The paperwork revealed things I hadn't known. My parents hadn't left suddenly. They'd been planning it for months. They'd liquidated accounts, moved funds overseas, tied up every loose end except the one named me. I remember staring at the signature lines, both their names written in ink that looked too neat for what it meant. Mr. Harrison's words faded behind the sound of my pulse. Aunt Margaret reached across the table and rested her hand over mine. It was the only thing that steadied me. Spring came early that year, with soft rain and longer days. I joined the school newspaper and began taking photos for it. There was something healing about looking through a lens framing the world until it made sense again. The other students didn't ask much about my family anymore. They saw me as the girl who's always carrying a camera, and that was enough. By junior year, life felt less like survival and more like living. Aunt Margaret encouraged me to attend every dance, every field trip, every chance to be a teenager again. "You've lost enough time waiting," she'd say, pressing a $20 bill into my palm, "for a movie or ice cream." It was never about the money. It was her way of telling me to belong. When nightmares came, and they did often, she'd hear me pacing and come to my room. She'd bring clay from her studio and set it on the desk. "Shape what you can't say," she'd whisper. Some nights I made nothing at all. Some nights I made small, uneven hearts that cracked as they dried. She never threw them away. Years later, I'd find them lined up on her windowsill, each one labeled with the date I'd made it. She called them proof of progress. The years unfolded quietly. I learned to drive. I applied to colleges. I graduated high school with Aunt Margaret in the front row, clapping so loudly it made people turn. She wore a navy dress with tiny white buttons and carried a bouquet of lilies she said matched my name. My parents didn't come. No card, no letter. By then, the absence had stopped surprising me. It had simply become a fact of my life, like freckles or the shape of my hands. On my 18th birthday, Aunt Margaret gave me a small blue box tied with silver ribbon. Inside was a delicate key pendant on a chain. "It's a reminder," she said, fastening it around my neck, "that you always have a home here, no matter where life takes you." Then, with a glint of humor that almost hid the emotion in her eyes, she added, "And it's also a real key to the downstairs office." Your name's now on the trust account for your college fund. I didn't cry then. I waited until she left the room, and then I sat on the edge of my bed and wept, like someone who had been handed proof she mattered. College came next. Northwestern felt impossibly far from Oregon at first, but Aunt Margaret made it easier. She flew with me to Chicago, helped me move into my dorm, and left notes tucked in every drawer. Breathe. Eat breakfast. You are not alone. I majored in business, minored in creative writing, and sent her every photograph I took. City lights reflected on wet sidewalks, strangers laughing in cafes, the first snow on the lake. She kept them all. During breaks, I came home. Portland's rain always felt like forgiveness. We'd spend hours in the garden, her with pruning shears, and me with my camera documenting the slow choreography of petals and weather. She taught me about property management and investments, how to read contracts, how to tell a trustworthy client from a clever one. Money, she said once, trimming a rose bush, only reveals who people already are. After graduation, I found a job at a publishing house in Chicago. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it, the smell of paper, the quiet hum of people making stories. Aunt Margaret visited once in a tan coat and sensible shoes, taking in the skyline with a proud smile. You built this, she told me, all the way from that blue bedroom, but even good chapters can turn suddenly. The phone call came on a Sunday morning when the city was half asleep and light slanted gold through my blinds. She had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctor said it was aggressive. Within an hour, I had packed a suitcase and booked the first flight home. Those 7 months were both the hardest and the most sacred of my life. I moved back into this blue bedroom, the same quilt, the same faint scent of lavender, and became her caretaker. We filled the house with soft music and sunlight. On good days, she'd walk through the garden with me, leaning on my arm, naming each plant like an old friend. On the hard days, I'd sit beside her bed and read aloud from her travel journals, describing places she had once loved. She listened, with eyes half closed, smiling at memories only she could see. She never complained, not once. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the cedar trees, she reached for my hand and said, "You were never a burden, Aelia. You were the daughter I always wanted but didn't know how to wish for." Her hand was cool, her voice thin, but her eyes were bright. I didn't answer, because words weren't strong enough to hold what I felt. After she passed, the house seemed to exhale. The clocks ticked on, but the air had changed. I kept moving through the days on autopilot, answering condolences, arranging flowers, signing papers. The funeral was small and dignified, attended by her close friends and employees, who spoke of her fairness, her humor, her kindness. My parents didn't come. I had found an email address, sent them the notice, but received no reply. I told myself I didn't expect one. When the last guest left and the house fell silent again, I walked into her study. Her glasses rested on the desk beside a stack of neatly labeled folders. The chair still held the shape of her faint but familiar. I stood there for a long time, one hand on the backrest, the other around the pendant she had given me. The world outside was dimming, and through the window the first autumn rain began to fall, soft, rhythmic, endless. That night, I couldn't sleep. I made tea, wandered through each room, touching the things she'd loved, the china cabinet, the framed maps, the carved wooden box that held her passport. Everything she'd built alone. And somehow, she'd made me part of it. When morning came, the phone rang. It was Mr. Harrison. His voice was gentle but formal. "She left instructions," he said. "Very specific ones. Could you come by the office this afternoon?" I agreed, unsure what to expect. By the time I hung up, the tea had gone cold in my hand. Outside, the sky had cleared, pale and unsteady, as if it too were trying to begin again. I set the cup in the sink and stood by the window, looking out at the garden she'd planted. The rosemary glistened with rain, the hydrangeas bowed heavy with bloom. Somewhere deep in the soil, bulbs she'd planted years ago were already waiting for spring. For the first time in years, I wasn't sure who I was without her steady presence beside me. But something inside me whispered that the answer the next chapter was already on its way. Harrison's office sat on the third floor of a narrow stone building downtown with high windows that caught the late afternoon light. The hallway smelled faintly of furniture polish and paper. When I stepped inside, his assistant led me to the same seat I'd occupied years earlier when Aunt Margaret had filed for guardianship. Only this time, the air felt heavier, thick with endings and whatever waited beyond them. Mr. Harrison greeted me with that same patient kindness, though the silver in his hair had deepened. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "She was very organized," he said gently. "You'll find nothing left undone." He slid a large envelope toward me. Its edges were worn from handling my name written in Aunt Margaret's familiar cursive, looped steady, unhurried. "Before we go through the documents," he said, she asked, "that you read this privately." I nodded, holding the envelope carefully, as if it might bruise. My fingers traced the seal, but I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. I needed to hear his voice, the one that had guided us through so much. "You said there were instructions." He adjusted his glasses and opened a folder thick with papers. "Yes. She left her entire estate to you, home business investments. It's significant, Aelia. Roughly 20 million in total assets." I blinked at the number, certain I'd heard wrong. "That can't be right." "It is," he replied. "She began restructuring her holdings not long after you came to live with her. She wanted to make sure you would always have choices." The words felt both heavy and impossible. Choices. A word I hadn't associated with security in years. He paused, studying me. "She also asked that I remind you, this inheritance comes with responsibility, not pressure. She trusted your judgment." I nodded, though my throat had tightened too much to speak. The room blurred for a moment before coming back into focus. The books lining the shelves, the clock ticking evenly on the wall, the light slanting through blinds in narrow stripes. Only then did I open the envelope. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the soft blue ink she favored. "My dearest Aelia, if you are reading this, I have moved on from this life, but my love for you remains. What I leave to you is not merely property, but purpose. You brought light to my days and strength to my heart. You have shown more character in your years than most manage in a lifetime. One truth I must tell you, your parents contacted me 3 years ago. They asked for money. I declined. I told them I had already provided for you. They may reappear when they learn what I have left in your care. Remember who stood beside you when it mattered, and that your worth was never theirs to measure. All my love, always, Margaret." The words blurred. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it against my chest, as if I could keep her near through paper alone. Mr. Harrison gave me time before he continued. "She was worried this might happen," he said quietly. "That they'd see your inheritance as an opportunity." "She was right," I whispered. He hesitated. "Do you want me to set precautions in motion?" "It's early, but there are ways to protect the estate before it becomes public record." I looked up, still holding the letter. "Yes," I said. "Whatever it takes." He nodded, already making notes. "We'll prepare a trust with clear restrictions. No one can access or contest it without substantial evidence of involvement in your life, which, of course, they don't have." His voice was practical, steady, grounding me. Still, a small part of me wanted to believe that the people who had walked away wouldn't come back, that they had, at the very least, learned something about the wreckage they left behind. But I knew better. 2 days later, it began. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something instinct or curiosity made me answer. Aelia, a woman's voice said, tentative and smooth all at once. It's your mother. For a second, I couldn't speak. Her voice was older but unmistakable. The same careful cadence, the practiced warmth she used with her piano students. Your father and I just heard about Margaret, she continued. We're so sorry for your loss. We've been thinking about you for a long time. We feel it's time we reconnected as a family. I felt my hand tremble, though my voice stayed even. And what makes now the right time? There was a pause, the faint clink of jewelry against the phone. Family should be together during difficult times, she said softly. You must be overwhelmed, dear. We thought we could come to help you sort through everything. The phrasing was deliberate, help you sort through everything. They already knew. I thanked her politely and ended the call, my heart beating too fast. Within an hour, I had forwarded their message to Mr. Harrison. His reply came quickly. Expect it. Do not meet them without preparation. I'll draft supporting documents tonight. By the following week, they were in Portland. They suggested a dinner, but I chose a quiet cafe instead, neutral ground. When they walked in, my breath caught despite everything I'd prepared myself to feel. My father's once dark hair had turned mostly gray, his suit pressed and immaculate, the kind of man who still needed to look in control. My mother was harder to recognize, her face smoothed and unfamiliar from too much cosmetic work, her smile practiced to perfection. My darling girl, she said, crossing the room. The endearment landed like something foreign. She smelled of expensive perfume and distance. My father shook my hand as though I were a potential client. You've grown into such a poised young woman, he said. His tone carefully balanced between admiration and ownership. We sat. The waitress brought coffee, and conversation unfolded like a play rehearsed too many times. They asked about my work, my apartment, my plans for the future. I gave short, polite answers. They nodded, smiled, and didn't once mention the years they'd been gone. Only near the end did my father shift topics. We heard Margaret's estate was substantial, he said, studying me closely. That must be quite an adjustment. My mother touched her necklace eyes bright with false concern. We only worry about you managing something so complex alone. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream curl like smoke. Aunt Margaret prepared everything before she passed. It's under legal supervision. My father's smile barely moved. That's good to hear. Of course, if you ever need guidance, I'd be happy to help. I do have experience with investments. His tone wrapped around the word experience, as if it were proof of virtue instead of what it really was, a memory of the schemes that had wrecked our lives once before. They left first satisfied with their performance. Outside the window, I watched them link arms as they walked away, two silhouettes moving easily through the evening crowd. They had waited 14 years to reappear and still managed to sound as though they'd been there all along. That night, I couldn't shake the echo of my mother's voice, smooth, well-timed, rehearsed. She was right about one thing. I was overwhelmed. Not by grief anymore, but by clarity. I went to Aunt Margaret's study, turned on the desk lamp, and pulled out the files she'd kept labeled estate planning. In the top drawer lay a note in her handwriting. If they return, tell the truth. Then protect yourself. It felt like a conversation across time. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison. They want to meet again, I told him. I'm sure they do, he replied. Would you like me to be present? No, I said. Not yet, but I need to know everything, every record, every legal step they took after leaving me. He was quiet for a moment. I'll find out. Over the next few days, he did. His investigator traced years of financial misconduct, bankruptcy filings, asset transfers, investments moved overseas. They had reinvented themselves abroad, living in luxury under slightly altered names. There were photos too: sunlit yachts, champagne glasses, smiles frozen mid-celebration. One image stopped me cold. My parents standing together on the deck of a boat, arms around a small boy. The caption read, "Monaco, June 2016. My birthday month." The child was their son, my half-brother, Alexander. They hadn't just moved on. They had replaced me. The discovery should have broken me. Instead, it steadied something inside I hadn't realized was still shaking. The longing that had lived quietly in me all these years, the need to be chosen, finally went silent. When the next meeting was arranged, I was ready. They chose an upscale hotel downtown, the kind with chandeliers and quiet music. More private, my father said, for family matters. The suite was elegant, impersonal, smelling faintly of lilies and cologne. My father greeted me with open arms. I offered my hand instead. My mother, draped in silk, gestured toward the couch, as though this were some warm reunion. "We want to help you, dear," she began. "With the estate. With all of it." I let her finish. Then I said evenly, "That's generous. Though I imagine your own financial situation has become complicated." They froze. My father blinked, his practiced charm cracking for the first time. "You've done your research," he said, trying to recover. "I had help," I replied. "You left a trail." The room went still, the air suddenly too small for all that hadn't been said. My mother's voice softened to that old pleading tone. "We made mistakes, Aelia, terrible ones, but we're still your parents." "Legally, yes," I said. "Functionally, that ended a long time ago." For a moment, none of us spoke. The sound of the city bled faintly through the windows, car horns, the rhythm of a world that didn't care about broken families or overdue apologies. I rose, smoothing my dress, the small silver key pendant catching the light. "Thank you for your concern," I said. "Tomorrow at 11, we'll meet again with my attorney. There are a few matters I'd like to finalize." They exchanged a look, equal parts confusion and relief. They thought it was the first step toward reconciliation. But it wasn't reconciliation I wanted. It was closure. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching the traffic blur by my reflection, caught in the glass of a nearby window. The face, looking back at me, wasn't the frightened girl who once waited by a phone. For the first time, I looked like someone who no longer needed an answer. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison. "Everything's in place. Everything," he said. As I hung up the clock in Aunt Margaret's study, struck 9. Its steady rhythm filled the quiet house like a heartbeat, reminding me that what waited ahead wasn't vengeance. It was protection, and maybe, finally, peace. Still, when I locked the front door and turned toward the driveway, I whispered softly into the morning air, "Stay with me, Margaret." It wasn't a prayer exactly, more like a promise. Mr. Harrison picked me up that morning right on time, his dark sedan waiting at the curb like it always had during the hardest moments of my life. The sky was gray with a thin edge of sun trying to break through a typical Portland morning, quiet and expectant. I locked the door behind me and stood for a moment on the porch, looking at the garden Aunt Margaret had tended for decades. The rosemary brushed against my skirt as I walked down the steps, releasing a scent that felt like both memory and courage. He gave me a small nod as I slid into the passenger seat. "Ready. As I'll ever be," I said. My voice sounded steady, though my hands weren't. We drove in silence for most of the way downtown. I watched the trees blur past the window and thought of the letter I kept folded inside my purse, the one Aunt Margaret had written to prepare me for this exact day. I could almost hear her voice saying, "You don't need to prove anything, Aelia. Just stand in your truth." When we arrived at the hotel, Julia Chin was already waiting in the lobby. She greeted me with a calm smile, her usual neat bun, and pressed suit making her look composed no matter the circumstance. She was younger than Mr. Harrison, but sharp, the kind of woman who knew how to disarm a storm by simply staying still. Together, we rode the elevator up to the executive conference room I'd reserved neutral ground open view of the city. The polished tables stretched across the room, the skyline reflecting faintly on its surface. I placed my papers at the head of the table and took a breath. Mr. Harrison looked over at me. "Once they walk in, you let me lead until you're ready to speak. We stay factual. No emotion unless it's yours to claim." I nodded. Understood. A moment later, Julia's phone buzzed. "They're on their way up." I turned toward the windows, watching clouds drift low over the rooftops. When the elevator bell chimed, I didn't move. The door opened behind me. I heard the rustle of expensive fabric, the click of heels on the floor. "Aelia," my father said, his voice full of forced patience. "We were expecting something more private." "This is private," I said, turning to face them. "Please have a seat." My mother's gaze flicked to the attorneys at my sides. "Attorneys?" she asked with a brittle laugh. "Surely that's not necessary for a family conversation." I gestured to the chairs opposite me. "This isn't a family conversation. It's business." They hesitated, then sat. My father straightened his tie, an old nervous habit. My mother crossed one leg over the other, her perfume too strong in the confined air. Mr. Harrison began without ceremony. "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, before we proceed, let's clarify the record. 14 years ago, you left your daughter in Ms. Evans's care. Since that day, you have provided no financial support, attended no major life events, and made no direct contact until 2 weeks ago. Is that correct?" My father leaned back, his tone smooth but tight. "The circumstances were complex. We believed Margaret could provide stability while we rebuilt overseas." Julia spoke next, placing a printed photograph on the table, a smiling family portrait from their social media taken years later. "You appear to have established that stability quite comfortably," she said, her voice calm. "Private schools, vacations, and a new child. Would you like to clarify which part of that prevented you from contacting your daughter?" My mother's lips parted, but no sound came. I sat quietly through it all, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "You didn't come here to apologize," I said softly. "You came because you thought you could still claim something that doesn't belong to you." My father's composure cracked. "We are your parents," he said, his tone hardening. "We have rights." "Rights you surrendered 14 years ago?" Mr. Harrison replied evenly. He slid a folder across the table. "Margaret Evans initiated a process before her passing that now reaches completion. You'll want to read the first page." My father opened it, scanning quickly, then stopped. His brow furrowed confusion, overtaking anger. "Adoption." "Yes," Julia said. "Adult adoption, legal and binding. The court has approved the posthumous completion of the process." My mother's hand flew to her throat. "This is absurd. You can't be adopted at 29. "You can," Julia answered smoothly. "And she has been." I watched realization spread across their faces, the kind that leaves a person suddenly aware of how little ground they've been standing on. "Margaret raised me," I said quietly. "She was there for every birthday, every graduation, every time I was sick or scared. She earned the title you threw away." My father's jaw tightened. This is her doing. She always tried to turn you against us. She didn't have to, I said. You managed that yourselves. The next document slid across the table. Mr. Harrison explained it in the same steady tone he might use in court. This is the trust structure. Once the adoption filing is finalized, all assets from the Evans estate are transferred into a protected trust inaccessible to anyone outside the designated board. Any attempt to contest it will open legal review into your financial history, including your prior misconduct with investor funds. The air in the room seemed to thin. My mother's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page. My father's face went pale, the lines around his mouth deepening. This is blackmail, he said finally. No, Mr. Harrison replied. This is documentation. They sat in silence. The city beyond the windows glimmered under a shifting sky. I reached for the final paper in the stack, sliding it forward with care. You'll need to sign here, I said, acknowledging you've been notified of the legal changes. Your signature isn't consent, it's confirmation. If you refuse, it proceeds without you. My father hesitated. My mother looked at him, waiting for direction. For once, he seemed unsure. You'll regret this, Aelia, he said, his voice low. I already regretted you, I answered, calm but clear. This just ends the echo. He stared at me a moment longer, then picked up the pen. The scratch of ink against paper sounded final. My mother followed her signature, a jagged line across the page. When I signed last, my hand was steady. Mr. Harrison gathered the documents, his movements deliberate. That concludes our business, he said. My father stood abruptly. Business, he repeated with disgust. This is what she's made you, cold, transactional. I met his eyes. No, she made me strong. They left without another word. The door clicked shut, the sound soft but absolute. Julia exhaled quietly beside me. It's done, she said. But I knew it wasn't not completely. The weight of what had just happened pressed against my chest, heavy but freeing all at once. We packed the files in silence. Mr. Harrison paused by the window. They won't let go easily, he warned. People like them rarely do. I know, I said, but I'm not afraid anymore. When we stepped into the hallway, the noise of the hotel felt distant, the hum of conversation, the echo of footsteps on marble floors. I stopped near the elevator and looked out through the tall glass wall at the city below. Portland stretched wide and familiar, the same streets where my life had both broken and begun again. As the elevator doors opened, my phone vibrated in my hand. My father's name appeared on the screen. Mr. Harrison glanced at me, eyebrows raised. I'll answer, I said quietly. I put it on speaker. His voice came through smooth, controlled, the same way it had sounded when I was little and he wanted something. We need to talk privately, he began. Without your lawyers, this adoption, this stunt isn't what your aunt would have wanted. She wanted peace, I said. I'm honoring that. You're being manipulated, he said sharply. Margaret always had her own motives. You're letting her bitterness ruin any chance we had to rebuild. I felt the pendant around my neck cool against my skin. She wasn't bitter, I said softly. She was kind. You wouldn't recognize the difference. He didn't answer. My mother's voice came next, pleading now. Aelia, please, we made mistakes. We lost our way. But this cutting us off, this is cruel. I closed my eyes. No, I said. Cruel was leaving a 15-year-old girl with 2 suitcases and a promise to call. There was a long silence on the line. You'll regret this, my father said again, but the threat sounded thinner this time, worn out by years of its own echo. Mr. Harrison ended the call. "We'll file everything this afternoon," he said quietly. "By evening, it will be official." We rode the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, Julia touched my arm. "You did it," she said. "Not just the legal part. The hard part, the part most people never get to finish." Outside, the rain had started light and steady. I stepped into it without raising my umbrella. The air smelled clean like beginnings. Across the street, the city moved as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But I knew better. Something had ended in that room, something that had been waiting to end since the day a car disappeared down a long driveway 14 years ago. I walked toward Mr. Harrison's car, the pavement shining beneath the streetlights. The rain collected on the silver key pendant at my throat, a single drop catching the light before it fell away. For the first time, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a door. The rain eased by morning, leaving the streets silver and still. The city was quiet in that washed-out way Portland has after a long storm, muted colors air thick with the scent of cedar and damp earth. I made coffee, stood by the kitchen window, and watched the light gather behind the clouds. The documents were filed overnight. By sunrise, the adoption was official. For the first time in 14 years, my name felt like it belonged to me, Aelia Evans. The sound of it was both strange and familiar, like coming home to a place I'd already lived in my heart. Mr. Harrison called just after 8. His tone carried the warmth of a task completed. "It's done," he said. "Legally, and more importantly, permanently." I thanked him quietly. After we hung up, I stayed by the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass until the sky began to clear. It wasn't triumph I felt, just a stillness so deep it almost frightened me. That evening, I walked through the house, the same one that had once belonged to Aunt Margaret, but now bore the small signs of me. The faint scent of lemon oil from the polished banister. The photos I'd taken over the years framed along the hallway. The sound of wind pressing softly at the shutters. In her study, everything remained as she'd left it. The books, the fountain pen resting beside her ledger, the globe marked with the places she'd visited. I sat in her chair and let my fingers trace the grain of the old oak desk. For the first time, the silence in that room didn't ache. It simply existed, gentle and unbroken. Later, I took my tea out to the garden. The hydrangeas, heavy with rain, bent low over the path. The rosemary had grown wild again, sprouting toward the fence. I knelt to pull a few weeds, the damp soil cool against my palms. It was work Aunt Margaret had always done herself, never hiring a gardener. "It's how I stay grounded," she used to say. Now I understood what she meant. When twilight deepened, I lit the small lantern by the back steps. The flame flickered softly in the wind. Somewhere nearby, a single robin began to sing a thin, persistent note that carried across the yard. I closed my eyes and listened. Weeks passed quietly. My parents left Portland the next day without saying goodbye. A typed note arrived through Mr. Harrison's office, formal, cold, and self-protective. "You've made your choice. Time will show you the mistake of turning against your own blood." I read it once, then fed it to the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened, turning into ash that scattered in the draft. The fire gave no satisfaction, only finality. In the months that followed, I focused on the living things, the company, the people who had worked under Aunt Margaret for decades. They were hesitant at first, unsure if I'd sell everything and start fresh. Instead, I gathered them in the conference room she'd once used and told them the truth. "I don't plan to change what she built," I said. "I just want to learn how she made it work." Their relief was visible, shoulders easing, voices softening. They began to share stories of her fairness, how she always remembered birthdays, how she'd walk every property before signing a deal, how she never missed an employee's milestone. Hearing those stories felt like being handed pieces of her I hadn't known. I spent long days reviewing projects, reading her notes, learning the quiet math of how trust multiplies when people are treated with respect. Gradually, I found myself not just maintaining her legacy, but extending it. Her business began to include community projects, small grants for housing restoration, and scholarships for high school seniors who'd grown up in foster care. It was during one of those planning meetings that Julia leaned across the table and said, "You know, this could be something bigger, something that carries her name." That's how the Margaret Evans Foundation was born. By summer, we hosted the first gathering in the garden, a small dinner for donors and youth mentors, all seated under string lights that shimmered against the twilight. The sound of laughter mingled with the chirp of crickets, and I caught myself smiling more than once without realizing it. Aunt Margaret would have approved of the food, simple, generous, honest. When the guests had gone and the lights flickered low, Mr. Harrison lingered by the gate. "You've done well," he said softly. "She would be proud." I smiled, tucking my hands into my pockets. She taught me how to be. That night, I found a letter waiting on my desk. The handwriting was uneven, the paper creased from too much folding. It was postmarked from Switzerland. "Dear Aelia, my name is Alexander. I think I'm your brother. I heard about you when Mom and Dad were arguing last week. I don't know why they never told me before. I just wanted to know if it's true." The rest was simple and careful, the way a child writes when he's unsure of the rules. He asked about Oregon, about whether I liked photography, and if I had any pets. He ended with a question, "Do you think we'll ever meet?" I sat with that letter for a long time. The boy was innocent in a story that had never been his fault, with Mr. Harrison's guidance. I wrote back, nothing that would harm him or stir conflict, just truth in the gentlest form possible. "Yes, I'm your sister. None of what happened was your doing or mine. I'd like to know you when you're ready." A few weeks later, another envelope arrived, his handwriting already a little steadier. He told me about his school, his love of building model airplanes and the snow that blanketed the fields outside his dormitory window. He signed it, "Your brother Alexander." That letter stayed pinned to the corkboard above my desk, a small bridge across two very different lives. On the anniversary of Aunt Margaret's passing, we held a memorial in the garden. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, shades of blue and violet stretching across the yard. Friends, business partners, and a few of her former clients gathered beneath the oak tree she'd planted decades ago. Julia stood beside me reading a few of Aunt Margaret's favorite lines about generosity. When the speeches ended, I spoke briefly. She believed family isn't who you're born to, it's who stands beside you when everyone else leaves. That's how she lived. That's what she left me. The audience was quiet for a moment, then nodded people who had known her goodness firsthand. After everyone had gone, I stayed in the garden alone. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere in the distance. I walked to the edge of the property where the roses grew in orderly rows. A robin landed on the fence again, the same bright-eyed visitor from months ago. I whispered, I kept my promise. 3 months later, a single email arrived from my father. Just one line above his signature. I saw the news about your foundation. Margaret would be proud. Perhaps someday we can talk about where we go from here. I read it twice, then left it unanswered for several days. Eventually I wrote back, "Thank you for your words. If we ever talk again, it will be with honesty, not illusion. My door isn't closed, but it isn't open without respect." That was enough. He didn't reply, and that silence finally felt like peace rather than absence. Now, nearly a year later, the house feels alive again. The foundation has its own office downtown, but I still work here in the blue bedroom that became my study. The desk faces the garden. The key pendant Aunt Margaret gave me rests beside the lamp, its silver glint softened by time. Each morning, I make tea and open the windows. I let the breeze carry in the scent of earth and rosemary. Sometimes I imagine her still moving through the rooms, humming softly, checking the mail, trimming a stem that's grown too wild.